Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Alasdair Pinkerton. I'm a political geographer here in the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway. And today I'm going to talk to you about an issue that profoundly affects the state of the modern world. And that is the issue of power and influence. Who has it? How does power and influence move and flow in relation to other global events? And I'm going to be speaking about that subject through the lens of a particular phenomenon, and that is superpower geopolitics. So I can talk about Superman. Of course, Superman is meant to be the embodiment of the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about the United States during the course of this lecture. But I'm also going to talk about an era when we had two superpowers that dominated the world. But also, what about the way that power is shifting and moving in the modern era? How are some countries declining in terms of their influence, and are other countries rising to fill the place left behind by the perhaps fading superpowers of the 21st century? I've got 30 slides and I'm going to try and get through this in about 25 minutes. So what do we mean by superpowers, and why is this a useful term for us? So I start off with a question: what in fact is superpower? And it doesn't just relate to that little fellow in the top left-hand corner of the slides. So what is a superpower? Well, there's a geopolitical definition of what a superpower is, but it requires a little bit of unpacking. And here's where we can start. So typically, when we talk about a superpower in terms of geopolitics, we're talking about a country or a series of countries who have particularly exceptional capacities. Typically, those capacities revolve around military capacity or industrial capacity. And very often, this term is related to whether a country possesses nuclear weapons or not. So nuclear weapon states. But it's more than just that. It's not just about the things that a country has, it's also about what a country is willing to do with those things. So is that country willing just to deal with itself within its own borders, or is it willing to project its power beyond its own borders globally? So a superpower very often has been talked about as having a global reach. They're a country willing to project its power beyond its own borders. Now, the term has a very particular geopolitical starting point. William Fox, a political scientist writing in 1944, used the term to refer to the Allied powers, the countries who were victorious at the end of World War II. And you can see those three countries represented in the bodies of three men here. You will recognize one, certainly, possibly more of the men in the foreground of this image. Clearly on the left-hand side, we've got Winston Churchill. In the middle, we've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And on the right-hand side, we have Joseph Stalin. The United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. These three men at the Yalta Conference at the end of the Second World War, effectively deciding on what the future structure of the world was going to be like. Three countries victorious in war who wanted to reshape the structure of the world, projecting their power and influence well beyond their own borders. Now, clearly, only two of these countries would remain superpowers in the years after the Second World War. As Britain decolonized, its influence very quickly diminished and deteriorated. But why might this term be useful? Why is it helpful to think about the idea of superpowers at all? Well, by thinking about the notion of superpowers, perhaps some powerful and everyday myths about international politics can be both confronted and potentially challenged. And there is a kind of received wisdom. There's a nice kind of fluffy idea that somehow all states are created equal, that all international boundaries are respected by other states, you know, more or less, give or take, except from the occasional kind of border dispute. But of course, as soon as we acknowledge the idea of the superpower, and a country or countries that are so powerful that they project power beyond their own borders, that they have an influence beyond their own borders, then we also have to recognize that that means that there are some countries whose borders are not inviolable. The superpowers are influenced somebody or something else. So therefore, the idea of sovereignty, a word that we hear so much about in our political discourse at the moment in relation to Brexit and other things, sovereignty is not an absolute thing. A country doesn't have sovereignty or not have it. A country can be sovereign, but can also be subject to the influences of a more powerful state. And the term superpower helps us, I think, to clarify that position. But I think there's another myth that we tell ourselves as well, and it is related to that little fellow in the top left-hand corner of the screen. When we think about superpowers, we often think about particular kinds of benign, helpful, civilizing, developed, or potentially hyper-modern kinds of agents. The countries who are in possession of great power have tended to be, not universally, but have tended to be, have all of those qualities about them. But actually, again, by thinking about superpowers, we begin to recognize that that is not the case at all when we actually drill down into the examples. And we'll see again some of this as we go on through this lecture. Another reason that superpower as a concept is helpful is because it draws our attention to the way that power ebbs and flows around the world, sometimes in short time frames, other times over much longer time frames. And this is a really suggestive image that I show you here from the G7 summit in France, in Biarritz in 2019. You will recognize undoubtedly Donald Trump on the right-hand side here, the President of the United States. And on the left-hand side, you've got Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And the way that they're holding their hands is, I think, really interesting, because some people talk today about the United States perhaps being a declining superpower, whereas India is very much a rising power. And here you've got maybe a symbolic baton passing of power and influence from the United States to India, or at least perhaps a recognition that these countries are increasingly operating on a not dissimilar level from one another. So we have the BRICS, which of course India is very much part of, India being the I in the acronym BRICS, the Brazils, the Russias, the Indias, the Chinas, and some people think the S is South Africa. These countries that have long been talked about as potential rising future global superpowers. The term might also be helpful though, because it draws our attention beyond the state altogether and maybe to non-state actors. So non-governmental organizations having often huge power and influence around the world, as do multinational corporations. In fact, some multinational corporations have got more money, more influence than many nation states. But also terrorist groups, sometimes very small groups of very heavily and highly motivated people who nonetheless have an excess of influence on the way the world works. But it also draws our attention to particular issues that are involved in the acquisition or perhaps the undermining of power and influence. So proliferation, what we're talking about there are nuclear weapons. Perhaps by thinking about superpowers as a concept, by recognizing that some countries are called superpowers because they possess nuclear weapons, perhaps this also reveals to us why other countries like North Korea seem so desperate to try and develop their own, because that will put them into a different league of power. But also think about what we're experiencing at the moment, that we have issues to do with the spread of disease, pandemic disease. No matter how powerful your country is, whether you're the United States or India or the United Kingdom, you are not immune to particular challenges that face the world. No matter how sovereign you are, how powerful your borders, it doesn't mean that you're immune to issues like disease. What I want to do now is just turn to an era where there was a very clear structure of superpowers in the world. So we're looking really at the years immediately after 1945 and the emergence of what you will know of as the Cold War, this geopolitical standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, an era when there were two superpowers. And what I want to do now is just focus particularly on the United States, because I think this is a really revealing case study of how we have come to understand power. Now, one of course, the defining features of the Cold War is that the United States and the Soviet Union never, in fact, met one another in direct confrontation. It was a Cold War. It was fought through kind of culture, sometimes through proxy wars. And in fact, one of the only times that we ever saw the United States and the Soviet Union genuinely face off against one another was in the kind of the fictional boxing ring here in one of the Rocky movies, Rocky III, where the United States and the Soviet Union are embodied in the figures of Sylvester Stallone and Dolph Lundgren. But what did the Cold War really look like? How did it function? Well, what you had, of course, were two economic superpowers fighting it out over global trade and finance. You had two military superpowers in the United States and the Soviet Union, two powerful nuclear weapon states. You also had political superpowers. The USA and the Soviet Union represented competing and rival global ideologies, capitalism versus communism. And as I said at the start, they were cultural superpowers. They fought against one another through ideas of public diplomacy, appealing to the hearts and minds of the global population, using soft power, the power of attraction, to draw people towards either the capitalist or the communist cause, through everything from music to film, to theatre, ballet, chess competitions, whatever it may be, whatever the device was, but attempting to attract people to these different ideologies. And in the case of the United States, here's some potentially interesting examples. During the 1950s, the Hollywood film industry, for example, produced a whole suite of biblical epic movies. And on one hand, you could just see these as interesting biblical epic movies, such as here, Charlton Heston, the actor, playing Moses in the Ten Commandments. But these were also allegories for the United States and indeed for the Cold War. Here you had an American actor playing this this Jewish biblical leader, receiving instructions directly from God, and ultimately fending off evildoers as he went. Very much an allegory for the Cold War. The United States also had international radio stations, such as Radio Liberation, through which it tried to speak to and attract people to the United States cause. But the USA and the Soviet Union also put a lot of emphasis on those 4 yearly contests in which the United States and the Soviet Union would battle against one another. And of course, those 4 yearly contests were Olympic Games, one of the only times that we actually saw the United States and the Soviet Union competing directly against one another, not in the field of battle, but in the field of sport. But the United States and the Soviet Union were also hard military superpowers. They were in possession of some of the world's most deadly arms and munitions. As I said before, 2 nuclear weapon states, but also states that invested a huge amount of money in developing some of the world's most lethal technologies. And of course, showed a willingness to deploy those technologies around the world. So a cultural superpower, an economic superpower, a political and ideological superpower, but also a hard military superpower as well. But the United States and the Soviet Union were also strategic superpowers. So it wasn't just good enough to have nuclear weapons or have this military hardware. You also had to have the willingness to project that power overseas. And here's just one way that the United States sought to visualize the world during the Cold War, with these areas of strategic command, with military commanders in control of these different regions that the United States plotted out. So if there was an uprising or an insurgency in Africa, USA AFRICOM would take the lead to devise a strategy to ensure that the United States influenced the outcome of that insurgency in a way that was beneficial to it. So it had this map, it had this plan for how it would project its power militarily overseas. But there's one thing that we absolutely do know, and that is that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were alone during the Cold War. So it doesn't really matter how powerful a particular superpower is. One thing we do know is that it relies on networks, it relies on having allies. So here you can see the NATO alliance in the blue and white striped colors, the United States, Canada, Iceland, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Norway, bound together in the NATO alliance. That was the way that the United States projected its power, particularly across the North Atlantic region during that time. There were other pacts that the United States were members of in Southeast Asia, for example. But there you can also see the Soviet Union, very powerful militarily, very powerful at times economically, but it couldn't exercise power alone. It was part of the Warsaw Pact. So the USSR, in coalition with Poland, the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc., and of course Eastern Germany, as part of the so-called Warsaw Pact. And that's perhaps, again, revealing of superpowers, that no matter how powerful you are, it's better to act together in kind of collective expressions of power and collaboratively than working on your own. So that was an era, the Cold War was an era of two great superpowers, but they didn't get it all their own way in the world during the middle to late 20th century. They were frequently challenged. And one group that sought to challenge the superpowers of the Cold War are represented again in the bodies of a number of men. Here you've got 5 men who fundamentally challenged the superpower Cold War order. I'll bring up the names so you can see them. Again, you might recognize some of these characters. You have Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, Nkrumah of Ghana, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, and Tito of Yugoslavia. And together, these men met at the Bandung Conference in 1955 with the intention of saying to the United States and the Soviet Union that we will not fall in line with your ideologies. We will not participate in your Cold War. If the United States was broadly considered the first world and the Soviet Union was considered the second world, these men created the third way, the third world. And of course, we now associate the term third world with, very often with less economically developed countries. But the original meaning of the third world was the collection, the coalition of countries who refused to subscribe to the Cold War geopolitical order. It's often referred to as the non-aligned movement. It emerged during the 1950s and 1960s, largely through the actions of post-colonial states, so states that were emerging from colonial rule, and they represented, as we say here, the third way. But the superpowers were also resisted in other ways as well. So no matter how powerful the United States and the Soviet Union were, again, they didn't get it their own way. The United States was resisted and ultimately defeated in Vietnam. The USSR, the Soviet Union, was defeated in Afghanistan in 1979. And we can see visual representations of those defeats here in the top right-hand corner. You can see a downed Soviet helicopter in the USSR-Afghan War in 1979, the Mujahideen celebrating on top of the helicopter having brought it down. And there on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you can see a Dewey helicopter evacuating the embassy staff from the US embassy when the city of Saigon fell to the communist forces in 1975. So these vastly powerful economic, cultural, military superpowers could be resisted, and sometimes by the most unlikely of enemies, small groups of often highly motivated individuals who were willing to resist the power of the superpowers. And thinking then to slightly more recently at events such as 9/11, 2001, the crash of the airplanes into the World Trade Center and the terrorist attacks in the United States. Some people consider this to be an exposure of a superpower, because the story of the United States as being incredibly powerful, absolutely sovereign over its own territory, in command, mastering the world, shaping the world, was then, of course, attacked at home. It exposed the fact that even the United States couldn't secure its own borders. It couldn't know everything about people living and operating and devising plots within its own borders. And even more recently, what about events like COVID-19 and what some people have referred to as the exposure of a particularly bungling superpower in the United States? The United States has one of the highest deaths from COVID-19 of anywhere in the world, totaling just in the past couple of days over 120,000 people having died. And that's led to journalists and political commentators referring to the United States as a bungling superpower. COVID-19 recasting America as a global chump, here from Vanity Fair just a few weeks ago on May the 18th, 2020. Or here from The Independent, Patrick Cockburn, very purposefully connecting the idea of superpower with its response, the United States' response to COVID-19. The US is losing its world superpower status due to its failure to lead on the COVID-19 crisis. And this time, it might not recover. So perhaps events like 9/11, perhaps its response to coronavirus has exposed an increasing weakness in the United States to at least to call itself or to think of itself as a superpower in the early 21st century. But what about if we look beyond the Cold War and beyond the United States and the Soviet Union? What about the rising powers that are so often talked about as a new force in the world? Well, people of course talk about China as being the next superpower, and I think we need to question whether that's a legitimate thing to do. And we also need to think carefully and critically about whether the United States is genuinely a declining superpower. One of the things we do certainly know is that China and the United States are increasingly competing over things like resources, markets, and strategic influence in several key places around the world, in Africa, Asia, and indeed Latin America. And of course, cartoonists enjoy the idea of perhaps the Chinese flag increasingly being pasted over the American flag in key sites around the world. Well, let's just have a look at whether the statistics bear out this argument in any meaningful way. One of the things we can have a look at, for example, is military spending. After all, we talked about the importance of being military hard powers. Well, you can see there that global military spending in 2018, this is the left-hand graph, that the United States still represents 30% of all of global military spending on hardware, on militaries. So the United States undoubtedly is still a vastly powerful country, but there you can see China on 14%. The second largest individual state in terms of its military expenditure. There, India, 3.7%, which is a whole percentage point above the United Kingdom at 2.7%. And if you look at the change over time, which is what the right-hand chart is showing, you can see that China has increased its military expenditure by 83% between 2009 and 2018, whereas the United States has decreased its military spending by 17% during that time. So perhaps that graph on the left will look somewhat different in a few years' time, as particularly if Chinese military expenditure continues apace. And not far behind China is India with a 29% increase, Saudi Arabia 28%, Russia 27%. So there are some countries that are really expanding their military expenditure and others that are dramatically cutting back. Will that represent a change of power status in years to come? China also has a strategic vision. So just as the United States had that strategic vision during the Cold War, so China has a similar vision now. This is a particular economic vision, however. This is the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of you will, of course, have heard of this. And ultimately, this is a way of connecting China and its markets and its natural resources that it seeks to export around the world by rail, by road, and by sea, and indeed also by pipeline as it exports and also imports gas and other liquid resources. So it has a vision and it is willing to enact it, and it's willing to invest heavily in it. Billions and billions of pounds are being spent to create these overland and maritime routes to connect China more strongly with Eurasia and indeed Africa. And that's leading to conflicts and tensions and an increasing, what some people refer to as a scramble for continents like Africa. And increasingly China is trading heavily with continents like Africa, 115 billion a year a couple of years ago. And there are all kinds of stories that undoubtedly you will have heard about Chinese companies buying vast farms in Africa, not for local food consumption in Africa, but in order to export that food to China. These kinds of stories are undoubtedly true, even if they're slightly exaggerated, and they will lead increasingly to tension, particularly as water and food resources become more scarce. But what about other alternatives? Well, a few years ago, there was a real flurry of excitement about the possibility of the European Union being a future global superpower, a counterbalance to the United States and indeed to China. And John McCormack and Mark Leonard wrote really influential books about the European superpower and why Europe will run the 21st century. They may have militaries or at least peacekeeping forces. They would have vast economic might. And there was a good reason why Leonard and McCormack thought that this might happen. When you look at the raw statistics of what the European Union promises, vast population, so 380 million people. These are figures taken from a few years ago. You compare that, for example, that's a larger population than the United States, a larger population than Russia, clearly not as large as China, but a vast GDP, a GDP greater than the United States. So in other words, a vastly powerful market. And you also had a European Union that increasingly was kind of building capacity, was willing to look beyond its own borders in order to exert its influence. It was supporting Ukraine, for example. It was investing in its own population. It had its own pot for delivering humanitarian aid around the world and had set aside a huge amount of money for stability and peacekeeping processes. So it was doing that kind of soft superpower work. There were very good reasons why the EU looked like it could be a future superpower. Brexit, of course, has fundamentally tarnished that possibility, although it isn't a foregone conclusion that the EU is going to fall away from those superpower ambitions and potentialities. Some other alternative superpowers, which are perhaps slightly more speculative, but if you think about it, the smallest state in the world, in the Vatican, has an influence well beyond its own borders. It's a tiny geographical enclave, but it has 1.1 billion adherents, effectively through, of course, Roman Catholicism. But I don't think anyone is really pretending that the Vatican is going to be a superpower in the normal sense, but undoubtedly it's a religious superpower. What about Apple computers, the world's most well-financed multinational corporation, a commercial superpower, undoubtedly? It has $158 billion in cash reserves. That's more than 3 times the American government. I am recording my talk here for you on an Apple computer. I have an iPhone, and I'm sure many of you do the same things as well. For many, Apple as a company are a gateway to the modern digital world. Another potential alternative superpower, a military superpower, but which does not conform to that of a state. Blackwater, which has actually recently been renamed Academy, is the world's most powerful mercenary army, used and deployed by the United States government during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A vastly powerful mercenary army that can be deployed at a moment's notice anywhere around the world. Far more powerful than many standing armies of sovereign states. But of course, it takes its cue from sovereign states. So it may be a military superpower, but it doesn't necessarily act alone, even if it does express its power and influence well beyond its geographical borders. It's based in Virginia, West Virginia in the United States. What about companies like Facebook, which influence our thinking, which guide our attention to particular online resources? It has an unprecedented power to influence, as has recently been said. There are 1.62 billion users of Facebook every single day. It has the power, as I say, to direct our attention to things that people might want us to see and to distract us from things that some people don't want us to see. It is hugely influential. Does this mean it's a potential global superpower? Well, this is undoubtedly one to watch. It's not a huge commercial success. It only made 6 billion in profit last year, so not nearly as successful as Apple in those terms, but undoubtedly has the ability to influence the way our minds work. But let's just turn finally to the United Kingdom. Can the United Kingdom in any way be considered a superpower anymore? Well, some people say that it can be. The image here on the screen, of course, is from the London Olympics in 2012, the opening ceremony, which sparked an incredible resurgence in the United Kingdom's soft power, the positive way that the United Kingdom was looked upon by citizens around the world. The UK has frequently topped the so-called Soft Power 30 index, the most powerful soft power in the world, a country that seems to attract people to its cause, punching above its weight. That's been supplemented and complemented by poster campaigns such as the Great Britain campaign, which you can see here with the Wallace and Gromit image, which you may have seen in airports and in cities around the world if you've travelled. The BBC World Service, Britain's voice around the world, is the world's most listened to international broadcaster. 250 million listeners every week listening to a British take on the news. And of course, the British flag is a kind of universal symbol that people like and respond to around the world. And there's a particular love of the Union Jack in countries like Cuba, for example. But again, there is a note of caution that we have to introduce here. Brexit has again changed everything, it would seem, and people are now warning us against hubristic belief in the UK as a superpower. Since Brexit, Anthony Salamoni says here, the UK has already lost influence on the world stage, and Brexit is only likely to make things worse. So who knows, perhaps the UK will not be topping the tables of the Soft Power 30 index in years to come. Certainly not as some commentators may think. So just a few conclusions then. I would say that thinking about superpowers really matters, and superpower states really matter. But we have to recognize that they are so often embedded within other kinds of relationships, networks, and actors. They rarely act alone. So the image of the lone superpower perhaps is not the right one. Perhaps we need to be thinking more like the Avengers, superpowers working together. We also need to recognize that power ebbs and flows, that some superpowers fall away and new superpowers emerge. And there's a whole raft of new potential superpowers waiting in the wings. But will the BRICS, will the Brazils, the Russias, the Indias, the Chinas, the South Africas, will the EU, will China show the global leadership required to truly act as a global superpower? They may accrue power for themselves, but will they project that power internationally? But I think we also need to ask whether we need a more nuanced understanding of power altogether, because we're not just talking about states anymore. We can't just rely on that 1944 William Fox definition. What about genuine alternative superpowers? What about multinational corporations as some of the world's most powerful organizations with an incredible ability to influence our minds, with vast economic resources and the potential to structure our economies and to influence our governments because of the power and influence that they have? So all of these questions are provoked when we think about superpowers. Thank you so much for joining me. You can always find out more about the Geography Department via Twitter. There's our Twitter handle, RHUL Geography, or on YouTube, where we always share our videos. Thank you very much. Do keep in touch. Bye-bye.